Hello there, students, and welcome to Mr. Little's History Bites. And today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 14, Part 3, the Chinese World System. And by the end of this History Bite, you should be able to answer these essential questions. How did the politics of the Chinese dynasties impact the diffusion of culture within Asia itself? And how did the regions around China adopt to Chinese influence during this time? So today we're going to be talking about China, but how China affected other places around China. So first things first, we're going to talk about something called the tribute system. The tribute system was a system that existed up until the very end of Chinese dynastic history, in which other rulers of other smaller states would come to China and ask and receive from the Chinese emperor the right to exist. Now, China, as the literal center of the world, was allowed to give this right to smaller rulers, right? And this involved a type of ritual that was very formal, but one of the parts of the ritual is called the kowtow, which is a type of kneeling, where you prostrate yourself before the emperor to show his superiority. Now, what states were involved in the tribute system? Geographically speaking, they were all very close to China, such as Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and Thailand. Now, of course, those states did not exist at the time. We are just referring to their medieval predecessors, but just so you have an idea about where this was, these are the states that are around medieval China. Now, the tribute system sometimes invokes an image of like a ruthless conqueror taking all your stuff, but that was not exactly the case. Of course, a delegation was expected to bring gifts for the emperor, lots of them. But usually the emperor actually didn't want all of these gifts. He didn't really have time to collect all these gifts. And so usually the emperor would keep a few of them, give some gifts back to the tribute mission, and then the tribute mission could take the rest of their stuff and potentially sell it within China. And so the tribute missions were often viewed as a trade opportunity. Right? Not just for rulers to go to China and be given legitimacy by the emperor, but actually for potentially to generate some state revenue by trading in China. And so many places that eventually developed healthy trading relationships with China in the Middle Ages began as tribute missions. And some places were really ecstatic about these tribute missions. So, for example, the state of Silla in what is now Korea, one time sent 3 tribute missions in 5 years. And a tribute mission is not a light undertaking. So that's clearly a lot of dedication, right? Here's a map of the regions that have traditionally paid tribute to the emperor. You can examine that closer on your own time. So we're going to talk about a few places that paid tribute for the emperor and sort of what their relationship with China was. So under the Tang dynasty, the newly created Silla dynasty of Korea agreed to pay tribute. And they went to the Tang dynasty and they witnessed these amazing Confucian values that were being on display at the Tang court. Although a reminder that the Tang dynasty was predominantly Buddhist, but it still practiced some Confucian values at court. And the Silla dynasty in Korea actually adopted this. And so the Silla dynasty adopted some of these Confucian values for their own court. Later on, the successors to the Silla dynasty in Korea, the Goreyo dynasty, went a little bit the other way, and they made Buddhism their official religion. Not that they still didn't have Confucian values. So, for example, the Goreyo dynasty set up a Confucian-style civil service exam, although it wasn't exactly like the Chinese one because it was much less egalitarian. They were pretty much upfront. They're like, nope, only aristocrats get to take this civil service exam. Whereas in China, at least in theory, anybody could take the civil service exam. So Japan, in a time referred to as the Heian period between these dates, sent a number of tribute missions and was heavily influenced by China. So for example, if you know anything about Japanese writing, you know Japan has a number of scripts. And one of these is referred to as Manyogana, and it was one of the first, and it's a type of script where Chinese words, Chinese characters are used to pronounce Japanese sounds. And so it's sort of just taking the Chinese script and assigning Japanese sounds to it. It's more complex than that. I'm not a linguist, but the development of Manyogana is a symbol of how heavy the influence from China was in Japan. In addition, 2 of the earliest written stories from Japan, the Chronicles of Japan, which or like a history of Japan, as well as the Tales of Genji by Lady Murasaki, were both written both in Manyugana, but also just in regular Chinese. During the Heian period, the emperors developed a Confucian-style bureaucracy, as well as Buddhism became very popular among the ruling classes and even with the common people. But the Heian period did not last, in part because the rulers became less and less effective outside of their palace. And so the Heian period gives way to what we call the shogunate period, which we'll talk about later. But because centralized rule ended in Japan, the bureaucracy that they had set up, the Confucian-style bureaucracy, was dissolved and kind of just withered away because it was no longer needed. And so it's important to point out that there's influence, but sometimes historical developments within a place impact the level of influence that can be had. In what's called Nam Viet, which was modern-day Vietnam, although only the northern part of modern-day Vietnam. At the time, the southern part of what's now Vietnam was a different culture, was occupied by the Tang Dynasty for about 400 years, and the Song Dynasty too. They didn't send tribute missions because they were continually resisting the occupation by the Chinese, which they did not like. But even though there was a military occupation and active resistance to that military occupation, there were nonetheless many cultural adaptations within Vietnam that came from China. One would be the creation of rice agriculture. In this part of Vietnam, initially people were not farmers, they were still hunter-gatherers. But over time, they adopted the Chinese system of rice agriculture. They also adopted the Chinese script. Vietnam is the only country in Southeast Asia that uses the Chinese script, or something that's descended from the Chinese script. All the other ones use a Sanskrit-based script. They also adopted Confucian values, and some of the most prominent Neo-Confucians were actually from Nam Viet, or northern Vietnam. And so not quite a tribute mission, and in fact active resistance, but still some cultural adaptations. And most notably, it should be noted that agriculture, Confucian values, and a writing system all benefited a ruling elite, right? So the native Vietnamese ruling elite that collaborated with the Tang Dynasty, these adaptations benefited them predominantly. So something to keep in mind. Now, of course, not just settled societies around China, but also the nomads to the north, right? Probably the most famous ones, if you've seen Mulan, would be the Huns, right? But there were a lot of other ones. But nonetheless, they also sort of had a tribute-style relationship with China. Under the Tang Dynasty, they, of course, paid homage to the emperor because the Tang was militarily powerful. However, the Song Dynasty was not as militarily powerful. In fact, the Song Dynasty even paid tribute to some of the northern nomads to leave them alone and not attack them. And so it's interesting with the Song Dynasty, there's actually an odd reversal of the tribute system. You have the Song Dynasty paying nomads to leave them alone or to fight each other and not fight China. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, the Song Dynasty still lost its northern territory to a group of nomads called the Jurchen. But nonetheless, there continued to be kind of a give and take relationship with the nomads of the north. Kind of sometimes paying tribute, sometimes not paying tribute relationship. So you should be able to answer those essential questions that I stated in the beginning. Thank you for joining me in this bite of history, and I'll see you next time.